People's history of Australia is recorded on stolen Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the People's History of Australia podcast. I'm your host and comrade, Christian. A few months ago, we ran an episode on resistance and rebellion by convicts against their masters during the colonial era, because it turned out that there was intense and often extremely violent conflict between convicts brought to Australia on the one hand, and the colony's governing class who ruled over them on the other. This seemed to surprise quite a few people who listened to the podcast, because the assumption perhaps is that during the colonial era, the entire white population constituted a single bloc with the same interests, which was unified in its mission to expand the colony and wipe out the indigenous population. It turns out, though, that things were more complex, because on one side of the frontier, the colonial administration was using troops and pastoralists to wage genocidal war against Aboriginal nations. But then, on the internal side of the frontier, very often the same troops and the same pastoral employers were then used to repress and crush uprisings and rebellions by convicts. The degree of violence and brutality was certainly different, but the enemy, the employers and the colony's ruling class as a whole, were more or less the same. Unfortunately, throughout Australian history, racism has been extraordinarily effective at keeping groups of people who have the same interests and the same enemies divided from each other. Which is why we think it's really important to look at moments in Australian history when this racism has been challenged by ordinary people. And in this episode, that's exactly what we want to do. Because after a solid 150 years of vicious racism against Aboriginal people, suddenly, in the 1920s and the 1930s, something radically different began to happen. Scores of mass meetings of predominantly white union members began, for the first time ever, passing motions declaring their solidarity with Aboriginal resistance. Masses of white unemployed workers fought alongside unemployed Aboriginal workers, and a huge campaign took shape across the country with the participation of thousands of white workers against frontier massacres of Aboriginal people. How did this happen? And how was it that for the first time ever, large numbers of non-Aboriginal people began to identify their interests with Aboriginal struggles? In this episode, we chat with activist and historian Paddy Gibson about just that. Paddy has relatively recently completed a PhD on this subject, and he talks about anti-racist theory from the 19th century onwards, some of the strengths and also some of the serious flaws of this theory, the factors that led to the development of a more coherent anti-racism in the 20th century, the role of communists and radicals in doing this, and in the second half of the podcast, the really, really inspiring mass, nationwide, anti-racist solidarity campaign that took place across Australia during this era. The first 30 to 35 minutes or so are relatively theoretically dense with left-wing theory, but you're welcome to listen to that twice or pause it if you need to. And then from that point onwards, we get into the more nitty-gritty content of practical organising in Australia. It's a really, really inspiring story, and it shows us that for all the racism of Australian history, ordinary people also have their own inspiring counter-history, that of solidarity, of anti-racism, and of coming together to fight together in the same struggle for a better world. So, we hope you enjoy the show.
So, welcome to the podcast, Paddy. Tell me a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, look, I'm a socialist activist based in Sydney. I've been active in social movements in Sydney since the breakout of the Iraq War back in 2002, 2003. And from 2007, when the Howard government launched the Northern Territory intervention, a lot of my activism has focused on struggles for Aboriginal rights. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns for Aboriginal rights. I lived in the Northern Territory for a number of years and fought against the intervention. I've also been active in campaigns against deaths in custody, supporting Aboriginal families who've had relatives killed in custody, and also campaigns against the continuing forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, which is a major scandal and a continuing crisis in contemporary Australia. Also very inspired by struggles of Aboriginal people to defend their land. I'm also a historian, and I work at the Jumbunna Institute at UTS, where I study the history of the labour movement in Australia and its relationship to questions of Aboriginal people, Aboriginal rights, and more generally look at the role of the labour movement in fighting against colonialism and racism. So yeah, I'm very lucky to work at Jumbunna under strong leadership of Indigenous academics like Larissa Barrent here as my supervisor.
So, why do you want to write your thesis on the CPA, the Communist Party of Australia, and its relationship with Aboriginal rights?
Well, for a lot of the work that I've done campaigning for Aboriginal rights, as a socialist, I've always looked to try to build support in the working class movement for the fight that's coming from Aboriginal people. You know, I believe that the organised power of the working class is the strongest force we have under capitalism to actually challenge the system and challenge, you know, the conditions that are facing so many oppressed people. And there's a really inspiring history in Australia of instances of solidarity from trade unionists and the trade union movement for Aboriginal rights campaigns. There's a long history as well of neglect of these issues and racism within the labour movement. But I was quite interested to look at where and how non-Indigenous workers have stood up and actually supported fights for Aboriginal rights, why that's happened, why people have been able to break with the racist ideas that characterise the Australian mainstream. These have always been very interesting questions for me. And it was actually reading a book by John Maynard, who's an Aboriginal historian, a Warramai historian, who wrote about his grandfather, Fred Maynard, who was a founder of an extraordinary organisation, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, which was founded in the 1920s and fought for Aboriginal rights. It was the first official, if you like, or organised Aboriginal political organisation with an executive that held meetings that kept minutes and, you know, had an identity as an organisation. This was the first of many to come in the 20th century in terms of the formation of an Aboriginal rights organisation. And what's very interesting about the AAPA and John Maynard's book about his grandfather and their struggle is that Fred Maynard was a wharfie. He was a waterside worker. And some of the politics that were crucial for setting up the AAPA, he actually learnt on the waterfront by meeting with black sailors from all around the world, from the Caribbean, from the United States, learning about the movement led by Marcus Garvey, the Black Pride movement in the early 1920s, learning about struggles of colonialism around the world. Those black wharfies set up a political organisation, an Aboriginal political organisation here in Australia. And I originally, for my PhD, was very interested to go and research what did the Australian working class movement say about this? What were Maynard's wharfie comrades doing or thinking to support that movement? Fred Maynard was a member of the Waterside Workers Federation. I found copies of his membership records over a number of decades, actually, when I was doing my research. But it soon became quite apparent that actually in 1920s Australia, there was virtually no support, or there was no formal support for struggles for Aboriginal rights coming from the Australian labour movement. There was no union that took a position in solidarity with the AAPA. There was no record of him addressing any of his workmates anywhere about the issues that he was facing. And that's quite different from what I knew to be the case decades later, where the Waterside Workers Federation, which was communist-led by the late 1930s here in Sydney, was very, very important for Aboriginal rights struggles. So this really got me thinking, why is it that in the 1920s the AAPA were completely ignored, but 10 or 15 years later, you actually had a situation where there was some support coming from the trade unions for Aboriginal rights. And that got me to looking particularly at the role of the Communist Party, who I argue really led the charge, fought within the Australian trade union movement for unions to recognise and take up the struggles of Aboriginal people. But the Communist Party in the 1920s also didn't have a particularly well-developed position about Indigenous people and didn't do anything to support Indigenous rights. So that was also a very interesting phenomenon. Why is it that in the 1920s there's no support, whereas later on you do actually get some strong support? And that's what led me to, the thesis, and to actually look into some of the history of Marxist ideas about Indigenous people, the formation of the Communist Party in Australia, and really explore how they came to a position of solidarity for Aboriginal rights and what the main factors were that influenced that.
At the beginning of the thesis, you examine Marx and Engels' views on anti-colonial struggles and Indigenous struggles. What were the strengths and weaknesses of their analyses?
Well, became very apparent when you're reading the publications of the Communist Party of Australia from the 1920s onwards is the central importance of Karl Marx as an ideological figure who actually provides, and this incredible critique of capitalism, which reverberates around the world and continues to inform and inspire the activity of workers around the world. So Communist Party newspapers would very often have extracts, published from various works of Marx. They would, advertise books for sale by Marx. They would advertise reading groups that were being done on Marx's work. So it's very obvious that Marx is a foundational philosophical and theoretical influence on the Communist Party here in Australia and on the global communist movement. It's also very much the case that Marx had quite an extraordinarily well-developed critique of global imperialism when he was writing his masterwork Capital and after, and understood the importance of struggles against imperialism for the broader revolutionary movement. The Communist Party in Australia was, fundamentally influenced by the Communist International, which was the international organisation of communist parties that they were affiliated to. And all the way through those congresses, the importance of workers in the industrialised world, in the imperialist world, the heartlands of Europe and other places like this of the global system. It was very important, the communists argued, that those workers actually oppose their own government's imperialist endeavours across the world and oppose the colonial domination of Western states over the majority of the world. In this point in time, the entire globe is carved up, into various European empires. And central to communist philosophy is the idea that the ideas that justify global imperialism are fundamentally white chauvinist, it was often called, white chauvinism. They're fundamentally racist ideas about the inferiority of colonised people, and actually building an outlook of international solidarity where your loyalty is to your class and to the struggling masses of the world rather than your loyalty being to your own national government, necessitated communists building a position in the working class movement to oppose the imperialism of your government and support the victory of armed national liberation struggles that were challenging colonisation around the world. So those ideas were consolidated in the Communist International and were crucial for the global communist movement, but they actually begin with Marx, and they actually begin earlier with the International Workingmen's Association, which was the first international, the first socialist international that brought together socialist organisations, anarchist groups, trade unions from across Europe and North America. I mean, it was supposed to be a worldwide organisation, but it didn't really have a presence outside of Europe and North America. But it had a very forward-looking program of international solidarity, opposition to war. Anyone, regardless of their race or nationality or ethnicity or gender, could join the International Workingmen's Association. So even though it was called the Workingmen's Association, women were allowed to join and encouraged to join, and that was a feature sort of the organisation. So that earlier formation, the first international, I came to understand had a really big influence, actually. This is where you started to see the first emergence of a critique, a Marxist critique or a socialist critique, which actually puts forward the importance of workers challenging war and workers challenging racism in order to build the strength of the working class as an international force. So Marx was the premier intellectual of the First International. Everyone who was elected to the executive of the First International was a representative of a workers' organisation. They were actually represented thousands of workers who was organised in a union or something else, except Marx. He was there as the intellectual who they all trusted and looked to for leadership. And you can see in a lot of his writings for the International Workingmen's Association, he begins to articulate some of those ideas that you then see in the Communist International about the importance of workers in an imperialist country opposing their own government and supporting the struggle for liberation in the colonies. So in the 1850s, before the formation of the First International, Marx and Engels had already, come to this conclusion that we need to actually be on the side of colonized people that are fighting against European powers. So they were very excited about the rebellion that grew in India in the late 1850s. Marx actually wrote to Engels to say, India is now our greatest ally. They were excited by the uprisings in China against the British and other imperialist forces. And they were also very excited about the mobilization that was happening within the United States during the Civil War, demanding freedom for slaves. And Marx actually says in Capital, Labour can never be emancipated in the white skin while in the black it is branded. He said, if we can't actually unite and fight as a class to overcome the horrifying condition of slavery, we're never going to be able to even grasp the idea or struggle for the idea of freedom for the entire class. So fighting racism, unity across, the divisions that are imposed on the system was really important for Marx. And with the Irish struggle for independence, it took on this particular importance where he said that it was actually a secret of British power over the British proletariat was the hatred they were able to foster amongst the English working class towards the Irish. Give the English working class a sense of superiority, that they are somehow part of this superior colonizing project, that they become loyal to England rather than loyal to their class. And he says, we're never actually going to be able to break some of the reactionary and conservative ideas that are holding back the English working class struggle unless we can win English workers to the idea of Irish independence. This would do two things. Firstly, it would have that ideological effect, as I've said, of breaking that allegiance and encouraging an internationalist revolutionary consciousness. But second, it would also weaken the actual operations of British imperialism. If they can be defeated in Ireland, if the armed forces can be defeated in Ireland, it will be about breaking chains and breaking the strength of the entire apparatus of armed British power that was also holding down English workers. So you see the seeds of a socialist position against colonialism, against imperialism, against racism in some of these writings of Marx and Engels at that time. I guess one thing for me, going and actually looking at this and saying, well, what did this mean for Indigenous people, was coming to realise the depth really of racism that existed at that time against Indigenous people in the Anglo-settler colonies in the United States and in Australia, meant that actually in this schema that Marx was developing in the First International and writing about national liberation struggles across the world, the need for the workers to support them, Indigenous people were completely missing. And this means that Marxists at the time, socialists, they actually miss a central dynamic that was going on in those societies. If you wanted to actually challenge the system, there was still insurgency being waged across the American West through the 1860s, still Indigenous people in struggle. And actually there's examples in the 1870s of US Army regiments being redeployed from conflicts against, say, the Sioux, to put down uprisings of increasingly militant workers in American cities who were fighting, came out fighting very, very hard after the Civil War, and there was a whole wave of class struggle. So actually the conditions were there for solidarity between insurgent Indigenous peoples and revolutionary workers, but at that time there wasn't the ideological tools. People accepted the racism against Indigenous people, wrote about North America as though it was terra nullius, wrote about Australia as though it was terra nullius, didn't actually realise the importance of the struggles that were going on, and the fact you could relate to them. And that had an impact beyond just the writings of Marx and Engels, because you don't really have any serious consideration of the issue of Indigenous people in the Anglosphere settler colonies like North America, Canada, Australia or New Zealand by any Communist Party or any Communist author until the Communist Party of Australia takes the issue seriously in the early 1930s, which I went on to write about. I mean, there's bits and pieces. It's not to say there isn't some commentary in some places. There's some organisations that make, the occasional newspaper article here or there. But in terms of an actual serious political analysis about what is the position of these oppressed people and what does our movement actually have to say about a struggle for their liberation, that's missing until the Communist Party comes along. I will just make one more point, and that's in the final years of his life. Marx did a lot of reading of what were called ethnographic sources. This is what we now know as anthropology or ethnology. But these were, bourgeois intellectuals going out into the colonies, studying Indigenous people, taking notes. He was fascinated by this. He was fascinated by learning about all these different kinds of societies that are making their life in all different kinds of ways right across the world. And you can actually go and look at Marx's, they're called ethnological notebooks from the late 1870s to 1882. And in these notebooks, you can see that Marx had started to break with some of that idea of terra nullius that I talked to you about before. He did recognise Indigenous people in North America and Australia. He did criticise the pretensions of superiority that the anthropologists and other colonial administrations had over Indigenous people. He did recognise the superiority, actually, of some elements of Indigenous society in terms of the collectivism, the connection to land, etc. And there's elements of Marx's late writings where you can see he starts to articulate an idea that some of the collective social formations that exist outside of industrialized capitalism, in fighting against the expansion of capitalism, they can actually provide an inspiration to the workers' movement in the industrial core, provide an example that there are other ways of living, there are collective ways of living, that we can actually make a life, outside of capitalism and inspire a socialist revolution. So in the late writings of Marx, there's some really interesting stuff going on, but none of it's actually published and none of it actually sort of influences in the same way as his other writings. But I guess to sort of bring that all together, you have an absence of analysis of Indigenous people that carries over from Marx into an absence of analysis of Indigenous people within the socialist movement. But you also have some very powerful ideas about the importance of challenging racism and colonialism that, when they're applied to Indigenous people in Australia, make sense, catch on, and actually inform some very serious struggles.
Great. So to go back to Australia, what was the CPA's approach to Indigenous issues in the 1920s?
In the 1920s in Australia, the Communist Party is quite a small organisation, so you don't really get a membership that's above, 300-400 people, at any point in time. So, it's quite a small organisation, but it is influential on the left. So one of the main ways communists can actually influence developments is agitating themselves, but also forming coalitions with more left-wing Labor Party trade unionists and other people who might take initiative alongside them. And through the 1920s, the Communist Party does play a role in challenging some of the racism that exists in the Australian labour movement. There's obviously a White Australia policy here in Australia that's hegemonic in the labour movement. They put up some challenge to that. They also encourage mobilisation in defence of colonised people that are fighting back for their rights. The most notable campaign was a campaign against Australian and British intervention against the Chinese Revolution in the mid-1920s. So there were a number of rallies and articles published and stuff like this saying, don't send an Australian warship to put down the Chinese Revolution. So they were active in an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist sense. But, like Marx, they were silent, actually, on the situation facing Indigenous people in Australia. So there's nothing really. There's the occasional newspaper article, like occasionally they'll note some atrocity against Indigenous people, but it'll be used as a sort of like general example about how horrible the system is, rather than any particularly developed idea about why Indigenous people in particular might be getting massacred, and, you know, what that says about the system and what that says about how we should fight. There's a couple of examples of some racist, you know, phrases or other things that are actually published in the Communist Party paper at the time. You know, the idea Indigenous people are a dying race was, you know, hegemonic in Australia, was reproduced in the communist press, or some, you know, vague suggestions about lesser intelligence or this sort of thing. So you've got, I would argue, largely an acceptance of the sort of mainstream ideas about Indigenous people that existed in Australia at that time, peppered with the occasional, well, we'll criticise how horrible they're being treated as a way to criticise the system. So that's basically the 1920s. You don't have anything. And like I said, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association is an extraordinary organisation that from 1924 1925 is active in Sydney. They had a conference in 1924 of 500 Aboriginal people. That was 1925. 500 Aboriginal people in Kempsey, you know, to actually demand an end to the New South Wales Protection Board. I mean, this is a major political conference. It's not reported in the Communist Party press. And as I mentioned before, Fred Maynard was actually he was a wharfie, so you'd assume there was some connection with some of the militants, you know, who were organised on the waterfront, but it's just not noted anywhere. So that's the main feature, I guess, of the communist position through the 1920s, is an ignorance and a dismissal. There's some, you know, examples of some discussions with Comintern officials or other people internationally where the Communist Party is quite dismissive of the idea there's anything really to consider about Indigenous people in Australia, or anything they could sort of offer to the movement. So there were two factors that led to the emergence of an explicit position of solidarity with Indigenous people by the Communist Party. The first of them was related to how they came to understand the nature of Australian imperialism. This is quite an important theoretical shift at the end of the 1920s. For most of the 1920s, the Communist Party writes about Australia and understands Australia as somehow being oppressed by Great Britain, right? So they saw that their task as communists in this outpost of the British Empire was to fight against British imperialism. That was the main thing they could offer to the global movement. We're going to fight against British imperialism. That was challenged at a Communist International Conference in 1927 by an Indian revolutionary activist actually called M.N. Roy. You can see there's some discussion about what was called the Australia question on the Comintern executive, about the nature of Australia and what the tasks of the Australian Party should be. And there was a visiting Australian communist who was in Russia at the time, Tom Wright, who was there to be part of this discussion. And M.N. Roy made quite a strident intervention in this meeting where he said that it's wrong-headed to consider the fight for Australian independence as somehow being analogous to the fight for independence in China or independence in India or Malaya or somewhere where you actually had oppression of a colonised people. He said Australia's not an oppressed colony. Australia actually is an emerging imperialist power. You have an independent locus of capital accumulation in Australia. You have an Australian bourgeoisie. You even have Australian colonies, right? Australia at that time was given a mandate under the United Nations to oversee Papua New Guinea, right? So Australia was actually responsible for colonial administration in Papua New Guinea and played a role in some of the administration, also in some of the other British-controlled islands in the region, in the archipelago, like the Solomon Islands, for example. So M.N. Roy's point was, if you think that Australians are oppressed and you're going to be demanding Australian independence, and this is somehow anti-imperialist, you're making a big mistake, and you're not actually doing what we need to do, which is to challenge the racism that's inherent and the chauvinism that's inherent within an imperialist country. Australian nationalism is a regressive ideology. It's an imperialist ideology. It's not an anti-imperialist position. There must have also been some discussion about this in Australia at the time, if you want to go and have a look at some of the records, because the Australian Armed Forces at this point were actually mobilising to fight in the islands to our north. So you actually had some quite brutal operations by Australian patrol forces in Papua New Guinea, including bombing some PMG villages. There was a mobilisation of Australian troops to put down a native insurgency in Malaita in the Solomon Islands in this period in the late 1920s as well. And you did start to see the Australian Party articulate that these forces that were going out, some of the articles said that they were sort of going to do the bidding of the British, but some of the articles started to say no. They criticised the little empire builders in Australia and started to see that there was, in fact, an Australian imperialism and an Australian empire that was being built in the region. And why is this significant? This is significant because, as we remember, as I described to you before, the Communist International made it a precondition of member parties of the Communist International needed to be committed to struggle against their own bourgeoisie and its colonial possessions, and needed to support the struggles of colonised people against their own bourgeoisie. That was a duty of communists. And so in the Australian context, if Australia is actually an imperial power, it's the duty of communists in Australia to support colonised people who are being oppressed by Australia and to fight for their independence. And this is the sort of formulations you start to see creeping into the CPA publications in 1928 and 1929. They start to talk about independence for the natives of New Guinea and in Australia. So it's in the context of analysing Australian colonial possessions in the region and the struggle of native people against the Australian regime that they also realised that Indigenous people in Australia, who were also being massacred in the late 1920s, right? There was a frightful massacre at Forest River in Western Australia in 1926. There was another massacre at Coniston in 1928. A lot of the same personnel, the colonial administrators who were across northern Australia ruling over Indigenous peoples there, would also go up into New Guinea, right? So it was a bit of a seamless colonial administration actually operating against Indigenous peoples in Northern Australia and in New Guinea. And the Communist parties started to talk about things in those terms, started to talk about the demand for self-determination of the oppressed Australian natives is somehow a duty of communists in Australia. So that's the way you got a bit of a breakthrough in like a theoretical sense, in a way they understood the world and understand Australia's position within the world. What was also happening at the practical level, at the concrete level in terms of human relationships and activity, was from the late 1920s, communists actually start to come into contact a lot more with Aboriginal people. And particularly there's a Communist Party branch in Darwin, which forms in 1928. And the basis on which the branch forms in 1928, the main issue that pushes them to actually form a branch is the question of whether Aboriginal people were going to be allowed to join the North Australian Workers' Union, which was the main union for working class people in the Northern Territory at that time. So there was a couple of activists who were in the Labor Party, a bloke called Waldy and another one called Mahoney, and they'd been in the Labor Party and they'd been in the North Australian Workers' Union, and they'd supported efforts that the North Australian Workers' Union had undertaken in 1927 and even in 1927, they had a campaign going to actually exclude Aboriginal people from jobs in Darwin to get more jobs for white people, right? So this was the way they thought, we'll deal with the unemployment crisis that's coming through the Depression by excluding Aboriginal people and demanding white people get put in jobs in their place, right? Really racist, stock standard white Australia, awful sort of approach to trade unionism. The communists responded to, well, our communists actually got a foothold in Darwin and established a branch when the Communist Party newspaper published an article in 1928 which said the colour line is a reactionary policy. We need to actually open the unions up to people from all backgrounds, migrant workers, Aboriginal, doesn't matter what colour your skin is, you should all be in the union. That's how our class is going to be strongest, and that's how we're going to fight against the situation of unemployment and so many, people in awful conditions, that come out of the indenture programs and the slavery programs that existed for Aboriginal people and other non-white workers in Northern Australia at that time. Unite and fight, right? And they quoted from Marx, they're talking about, it can never be free in the white skin if in the black it's branded. They drew on this sort of anti-racist history within the global workers movement to say, we need to actually overcome racism and unite and fight. And it was that argument that resonated with a number of labour movement activists in Darwin. Waldie travelled to Sydney in 1927, got a bit of an education from the Communist Party, went back, prosecuted this argument. They set up the Darwin branch of the Communist Party in 1928. And from then on, there's actually quite a lot of dialogue between the branch in Darwin and the party, sort of central committee and the leadership on the East Coast about a lot of the issues that were facing the party up there. They've got a lot of issues that actually come out of police brutality against Aboriginal people, what was going on with the extraordinary discrimination, etc. So that was the first sort of breakthrough in terms of you've got a branch where you've got organised communists who are taking an argument into the union, and they did take an argument into the union that it should open up membership for Aboriginal people. It took a good 15 years actually, but of serious fight before that was actually won within the North Australian Workers Union, but it started the Communist Party in 1928. As the Depression hits all around Australia, you also get growing contact between Aboriginal people and members of the Communist Party. That happens for two reasons. Firstly, because the Communist Party grows enormously. So the depths of the social misery that come with the Depression, the homelessness, the unemployment, drive people into the arms of the Communist Party. The Communist Party grows tenfold actually between 1928 and 1934. And, so because people are just desperate and hungry and this system is broken and the rich have still got all of their luxury while you're squalid in the street, that resonates, that makes sense. People join the Communist Party. And out of these unemployed movements and the situation that was going on at the time, you had a lot of rough camps of unemployed workers on the fringes of country towns, or even here in Sydney, places like Happy Valley down near La Perouse, big sort of ramshackle shacks and humpies and things like that unemployed workers were putting up. Well, often in those places, Aboriginal people had been there for a long time on the fringes of town, negotiating poverty and exclusion and everything that a lot of these unemployed workers were now dealing with for the first time. So a lot of the time you had a situation where Aboriginal people who may have been employed previously were the first to be sacked. Then a lot of non-Indigenous people were sacked. And then you've got these unemployed camps where there's Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people, both of them with the experience in the union movement, both of them unemployed. Out of some of those experiences, you got a ferment and you got some of the unemployed workers movement starting to raise demands for Aboriginal rights. So in a number of places in New South Wales through 1931 and 1932 and up into Queensland, country New South Wales and Queensland, as well as the cities, you had meetings of unemployed workers demanding equality in dole payments. Because one of the things that the state governments were doing, both to save money, but also to try and break up, these camps on the fringes of town, was demanding that Aboriginal people go back to the mission, go back to the reserve and get rations there, rather than pay them a full dole payment that non-Indigenous workers were getting. So they actually refused to pay the full dole payment to Aboriginal workers, forced them to go back to the mission and pay them an inferior rate. And a lot of these unemployed workers organisations started passing resolutions calling for equality in dole payments and work for everyone. And they did it very much off the back of the agitation of the Communist Party around anti-racism, around why we actually need to unite, why we need to challenge white chauvinism, why that makes us stronger as a class organisation. So, as I said, you had both a theoretical shift where the party's starting to actually now look for Indigenous struggle as something that they should support, as members of the Comintern who should support colonised people against Australian imperialism. There was that going on. And then there was also growing contact between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in really dire conditions where people wanting change and challenging their views of the system were being challenged. And they were now being exposed to Aboriginal people who talked and explained about movements like the AAPA, which for the first time actually gets recognised by the Communist Party, who write in their paper that it was disgraceful that the revolutionary movement allowed the AAPA to be smashed up by the missionaries and the police, the welfare board. The AAPA was broken up and driven underground in 1928. The communists recognised after the fact that that was a big defeat and they should have been there fighting alongside the AAPA and start to actually develop a far more sophisticated position in solidarity with Indigenous people.
So can you talk about how all this leads to the CPA's 1931 program for Aboriginal rights and what the significance of this program was?
Yeah, so the breakthrough in terms of, like a theoretical articulation about the nature of Indigenous oppression, it comes in September of 1931, whereas the man Herbert Moxon, who'd been a leader of the Communist Party in that period, in that depression sort of period, he was sort of falling out of favour with the party actually, and on his way out because of internal Stalinist shenanigans, which we don't have time to go into. But he was, sort of being pushed out. He was on his way out by the time he writes this program, but it's with the guidance of the Central Committee that he actually writes the program. You can see in the minutes he goes and reports and says, that the issues in terms of with Aboriginal rights are coming up a lot more. We need a program. We need something to say about, the nature of Aboriginal oppression and what we're saying should actually happen, to liberate Aboriginal people. The Central Committee commissions him to go off and draft a program. He comes back, he does draft a program, and it is an extraordinary document. The document which, on the one hand, sets out the nature of Aboriginal oppression in very, very stark terms. So talks about the genocidal massacres that founded Australia, that cleared the land for pastoralism in Australia, talks about the fact that those massacres are still continuing on the frontier, talks about the theft of children and that the theft of children was an attempt to exterminate the race. So it actually describes this, what we now know as the Stolen Generations, as being a genocidal program, even though he doesn't use that language. There's a theory put forward about why the Australian capitalist class is trying to exterminate Aboriginal people, where he says that they're trying to wipe out the memory of Aboriginal ownership of the continent and cover up the grand crimes of British Australian imperialism that have actually established Australia. So Indigenous people need to be slaughtered to eliminate the memory of Indigenous control of this continent and to eliminate any understanding of the brutality that is actually at the foundation of Australian society, right? So quite a profound sort of articulation of this, war on memory of Indigenous, of Indigenous occupation and ownership. There's, this gushing sort of discussion of this oppression. There's another very important feature of the way he talks about Aboriginal oppression, which is at that time, it was quite fashionable in academic circles. It was certainly government policy, but you even see it discussed in similar terms amongst Indigenous people themselves, which was divisions on lines of caste. Right? So there was this caste division that the government sort of set up between, they're very offensive terms now, but, like the full bloods and the half castes and this sort of division of Indigenous people. And there's this real appeal, certainly for the likes of the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association or the Australian Aborigines League, which was formed in Melbourne in the early 1930s. The Aboriginal activists rejected this, and spoke about a feeling of a pan-Aboriginal sentiment, a feeling of unity and common struggle of Indigenous people across the continent. That was really picked up in Moxon's program, in the Communist Party's program. And they talked about the need to build a struggle that unites both the tribal Aborigines and the half-caste that were in the working class, and that everyone was oppressed, and that there was a struggle that needed to go across, all of those lines and be taken up by the entire working class. He also makes a very pointed argument that most of the left thinks about Aboriginal oppression as something that's just happening in Northern Australia, as this sort of far away thing that's happening to these hapless people, where he says actually in New South Wales, in Victoria, in every state, there's awful oppression, and there's issues of the Aborigines that need to be taken up by the working class movement. So he makes a case for fighting against Aboriginal oppression right across the continent. In Moxon's program, he just puts it as a unified struggle. He says, even in New South Wales, he's demanding that there's committees of Aboriginal people that are established to self-determine their own affairs, that land, fertile land and watered land is returned to Aboriginal people to allow them to make a life, that they need resources to actually develop their culture and their education on their own terms, their languages on their own terms. So it's a very far-reaching program in terms of its demands for self-determination and autonomy, but it also demands the complete abolition of the protection board. So the racist boards that were controlling Aboriginal life, abolish the whole thing, full equality at law, stop taking children away, stop, the exploitative work conditions that allowed Aboriginal people to basically work as slaves, demand equality in dole payments. So there's all the demands for full equality, but also the demands for self-determination and respect for particular Aboriginal rights. And it ends with this appeal to struggle with the Aborigines against Australian imperialism. It puts this forward as like a crucial task for the revolutionary movement in Australia. Now, there's been historians write about this, say, look, this is the most radical program for Aboriginal rights written by anyone until the 1960s. And it's true. It's extraordinary in terms of its vision and in terms of the fact that we still actually take up so many of these demands today. It actually demanded that there was establishment of Aboriginal states in North Australia that were fully independent of imperialism, which was never a demand coming from Aboriginal people themselves, actually. It was more of a bit of a manufactured thing to fit a bit of a template, they thought might fit into the sort of global communist theory at the time and the way that minority, struggles were being discussed. But yeah, as a whole, it was a really, really important document. Moxon himself, after writing the document, he actually travelled to Bourke, where there was quite a strong unemployed workers movement and there was relationships with Aboriginal people in the movement up there. And he's driven out of Bourke by a fascist mobilisation, which actually attacks campers on the riverbank and drives him out of town. And when he's driven out of town, some of the articles that appear in the local press talk about the fact that the communists were stirring up the Aborigines and that this was creating this particular danger in the town of Bourke that needed to be stamped out because the Aborigines were already showing greater signs of being insolent under the influence of communists. So it was just quite interesting that was seen as a real threat at that time, the sort of solidarity that had started to grow between some of the communists and Aboriginal people in the unemployed workers movement.
Can you tell us about the campaign provoked by the spearing of the police constable McCall and how that prevented a punitive police expedition?
In 1931, as I said, in September of 1931, you get this articulation of a theoretical basis for Aboriginal liberation in socialist revolution. It actually comes out of Moxon's program. But it also needs to be said, Moxon himself leaves the party not long after this, gets quite disillusioned with all the shenanigans that are going on within the leadership. And even though they've published this great program, which calls on the Communist Party to take up the struggle of the Aboriginal people in every state, doesn't mean the party actually does it, right? So, this is published in 1931. There's no real evidence of any serious campaigning by the party for Aboriginal rights for a couple of years. There's some very interesting things that happen in that period in terms of evidence of sort of growing relationships at the rank and file level in the unemployed workers movement. But in terms of like actual campaigning on the ground against the government, you don't really see anything happening, being led by the Communist Party until 1933. And this is where you really see that sort of like theory that they'd been arguing, printing in the press about how a struggle for Aboriginal rights might happen, actually take life. And you actually do get a campaign that does have a real impact on politics. It was in August of 1933, the 1st of August, that police officer Constable Albert McCall was part of a police expedition that went to East Arnhem Land to investigate the killing of some Japanese fishermen, trepang fishing. This is a sea cucumber, trepang, and there's a big industry that actually existed in Northern Australia to harvest the trepang. And even though you had a White Australia policy, which was, supposed to be keeping Asians out, and there had actually been people come from Makassar and other areas around the Indonesian archipelago had come down to fish for trepang actually for hundreds of years prior to the coming of the British, right? That trade was disrupted by colonisation of Australia. In early 1933, the Australian government was turning a blind eye or sometimes giving permits, or was allowing Japanese to actually come down into the area to harvest trepang. And because of a labour dispute, actually, with some of the Yolngu people that existed at the time and some brutality from one of the overseers there were a number of Japanese who were killed by some Yolngu people. The police went out to investigate and McColl found himself on what was called Wooda Island, just off the coast near Blue Mud Bay. And he couldn't get any intelligence about who killed the Japanese or where people might be who might know about the Japanese. So he decided to just chain up a couple of local women and demand that they take him to who killed the Japanese, right? I don't know if people had understood what he was saying or whatever, but he was walking around Wooda Island with some Aboriginal women chained by his side for some time. One of these women, Japari, had a husband, Dakaya Wirpanda, who saw the group and saw his wife in chains. And his reaction to that was to spear Police Constable Albert McColl dead. So he hit him with a spear from about 50 feet and he dropped dead, hit him right through the heart and he dropped dead. And Dakai's descendants have explained that actually, Dakai's family had been through frightful massacres. Like his whole mother's side of the family had been killed in an earlier massacre, in Arnhem Land. So he just reacted to seeing these police on his land. Like, they're here to kill us, they're here to take our land. And he just killed this police officer. Now, in Australian history, right from the first colonisation in 1788, the response to an event like this, the killing of a police officer or a white person generally by Aboriginal people, was to go out and massacre everyone, right? Like, massacres in Australia are basically a counterinsurgency strategy. They always sort of come in the wake of resistance activity, trying to put down the resistance and, ensure that an area was pacified by basically slaughtering all the people. So this had been the pattern across the Australian colonial frontier, is what we call a punitive expedition would be sent out in the wake of a killing and just massacre, people, shoot everyone up. And this is exactly what they started to plan to do in the Northern Territory. So police went back from this incident straight to Darwin, reported to their heads in Darwin what had happened, and immediately they started to prepare a war party. So it was being openly reported in the Darwin press that we're calling for volunteers. We've got police who are going to go out, but we also want special constables, they called them. They were going to deputise people to actually go out with trackers, like Aboriginal people would go with them, black trackers would go with them, and we're going to go out and have a punitive expedition to teach the natives a lesson, because the Yolngu in this area had not yet been put down. They were still insolent. They were still not obeying white direction. And so we actually have to teach them a lesson by going out and massacring them. This was like openly being discussed in the press in Darwin. And actually the administrator of the Northern Territory wrote to the Interior Minister in Canberra, because it's the Northern Territory, then it's still under the control of Canberra. So they write to the Interior Minister in Canberra and request significant guns and ammunition to actually be shipped to Darwin for the purposes of this punitive expedition. And that permission for that equipment to be deployed from Defence Department stores to the Northern Territory Police on a ship was granted actually by the Interior Minister. So the official position of the government at the time seemed to be, we're going to send a massacre party out to massacre Aboriginal people. When the press were putting questions to the Interior Minister about what would happen, he was saying he was quite confident that he'd be able to support the plan of Weddell, the administrator of the Northern Territory. They said that, other ministers who had experience in native administration in New Guinea would also not hesitate to send a punitive expedition. So all the momentum was running towards there being a massacre in response to the killing of this police officer. That turned on its head quite quickly in a matter of days. And what turned around was the fact that the government was actually inundated by protest telegrams. And so you had, a large variety of organisations, humanitarian organisations, some feminist organisations like women's organisations wrote. There were, missionaries who obviously had, quite a bit to do with Aboriginal people, were writing letters saying, don't do a punitive expedition, right? They wanted a more liberal approach to frontier affairs, They thought we need to arrest these people and we need to bring them in and show British justice, show the natives how we deal with these things in a civilized way that will help get them to accept the legitimacy of colonial rule, accept Australian law, etc. So they said, we want a more liberal approach. And they had some impact, but these organisations also had been active in Aboriginal affairs for quite some time. When the Coniston massacre happened in 1928, there was quite a big outcry, and there were a number of humanitarian organisations which, consistently wrote to government. The Association for the Protection of Native Races is one example of quite a serious organisation made up of clergymen and anthropologists, missionaries, who would write to the government consistently about the problem of the Aborigines and how they could be doing things in a bit more of a liberal way, right? So this was a bit of a continuation of that. What was new in 1933, in amongst the protests that were coming from the humanitarian organisations, though, suddenly you had the presence of the labour movement really start to assert itself. And that came from agitation from the Communist Party. So the Communist Party, as we've discussed, had a branch in Darwin. And in 1933, when they got news of this massacre that was being planned, they printed the first protest anywhere in Australia. They printed a bulletin. They had a newsletter that went out from their unemployed workers movement. They put that newsletter out and it condemned the plan for a massacre, and it called on all people who care about Aboriginal rights or humanitarianism to protest against the massacre, refuse to enlist, and to try to actually stop the party being sent so that they said we need to prevent another butchering expedition. They said that this would be another massacre just like we saw at Coniston. So the unemployed workers movement in Darwin called for protests. They wrote to the Communist Party, and the Communist Party's main newspaper also in August published an article calling for protests, and it put the operation that the police were going to do in Darwin in an anti-imperialist framework. It said, this is a war on the Aborigines, right? This is an invasion of their territory. And so we need to actually mobilise workers' organisations against war, just as we've opposed war everywhere where it rears its head. And like the scars of the First World War ran very deep in Australia. You had very deep opposition to war across the union movement as a result of what had happened during the First World War. And so putting things in those terms, that this is a war on the Aborigines, it's imperialism, we need to fight for peace, we need to fight for self-determination for these people who are a colonised people, that resonated in the labour movement, and you got a lot of protests coming from both the unemployed workers movement, but also from some of the established trade unions. And there was actually protest resolutions from both the Victorian Trades Hall and the Trades Hall in New South Wales, which not only opposed a police massacre party being sent out, but also called for territorial autonomy for Indigenous people on their reserves, and for the right to actually stop police even encroaching onto those reserves, that they should have powers, over those reserves in terms of it should be their territory. So, this was an entirely new phenomenon, that the labour movement would be entering into the debate about Aboriginal affairs, and it was driven by the agitation of the Communist Party, and it had a really big impact. It had an impact in two ways. Firstly, it added social weight to the protests that were coming in from humanitarian and missionaries and other organisations. But the second thing that it did was in the second half of September, when the government was still talking about sending police into, armed police, sending them into Arnhem Land to apprehend these murderers. They had shipped the guns and ammunition to Darwin, even though they were promising it won't be a punitive expedition. We promise, it won't be a massacre. We wouldn't do that, right? This is what they were saying to all the humanitarian organisations. They were still planning to send armed police out. And if you look at the correspondence from police, the police certainly thought they were going into a war, right? They were writing things like, whose blood will stain Arnhem Land, whether black or white, only time will tell. They thought they were going into battle, right? They were going in to actually shoot up the Yolngu and fight against them. So the communists maintained opposition to any police operation. They said, we're not just against a punitive expedition, we're against any armed police operation. And they won that position within a number of unions, within the unemployed workers movement, and even when the missionaries and humanitarians had accepted, yes, we accept it won't be punitive, the labour movement kept up the agitation and said, we don't want any expedition. And there was a major meeting called by the Victorian Council Against War, which had a number of union officials as part of it, that the Communist Party was also part of. 500 people met at a town hall in Melbourne, and they resolved that they would actually support Aboriginal people to fight back against the police if they went into their land, because they would be justified in doing so. It would be self-defense to do so. And they had some heavy hitters from the labour movement as part of that meeting. There was Frank Brennan, who'd actually been the Attorney General in the Scullin Labour government in 1930. He gave a speech where he said if Aboriginal people kill police, it's justifiable homicide because they're coming into their territory to oppress them. Right? So this was a turning point. This is when the government realised we actually can't get away with sending armed police into Arnhem Land, because the labour movement, who's promising escalating action, is actually saying they take the side of Aboriginal people against the police. And this was when basically the police operation was called off, and they said that they would support missionaries to go unarmed into Arnhem Land to see if they could convince the Aboriginal people there to come into Darwin to face trial, but they wouldn't send any armed expedition. And I argue this was the end of the frontier wars in Australia. So Indigenous people continue to get brutalised by police in so many ways. You know, still today we fight against police brutality against Aboriginal people. But an organised massacre party going out to teach the natives a lesson, in August 1933, that was acceptable. In September 1933, it wasn't acceptable. And it was never mooted again. The government never spoke again about sending out a massacre party to teach the natives a lesson. And that was because the labour movement finally, after so many years, had actually stood up and said, stop the war on Aboriginal people.
So can you talk about how the campaigning continued when Dakia was brought to trial?
Well, the campaign actually escalated when Dakia was brought to trial. So there was a period of quiet when there had been a win and the government had committed that they wouldn't send out the punitive expedition. The campaign demobilises. But by early the following year, by early of 1934, there start to be Communist Party-led protests again about Aboriginal rights. And that started actually just prior to when Dakia was brought into Darwin to come on trial. There was another big group of Aboriginal people who'd been rounded up in the western half of the Northern Territory. They were called in the press the Fitzmaurice River Natives, Murrin Pathi speakers from what's now Wadair or Port Keats, that sort of an area out in the western part of the Northern Territory. An extraordinary police operation actually had swept out there and chained up many hundreds of Aboriginal people, but it eventually brought 8 people and a number of witnesses into Darwin charged with killing 2 white prospectors who they claimed that they were innocent, but these 8 were sentenced to hang. Right, so 8 Aboriginal people were sentenced to hang, and there was a response from the labour movement here in Sydney. Actually, there was a protest in the Domain. There was an International Solidarity Day demonstration that was taking up, issues of political prisoners overseas. That demonstration also took a resolution to demand freedom for the Aboriginal people that had just been sentenced to death. But there was a number of Yolngu actually came in with the missionaries, agreed to come in with the missionaries late in 1933 to travel into Darwin to face trial. Some of Yolngu who'd killed the Japanese and Dakaya who'd killed McCall. They were treated terribly. So they were bashed as soon as they arrived in Darwin. They were put in jail. They were mistreated for a number of months. Horrible sort of conditions in the jail. And there was agitation that started that actually took on a lot more of the scale of the campaign was a lot bigger than it was in the short campaign to stop the punitive expedition. There was a number of months, May, June, July, August, where there were public events, rallies, resolutions that were taken by various campaigning organisations, resolutions that were taken by mass meetings of unemployed workers or trade unionists, calling for freedom for political prisoners in Darwin. The Aboriginal prisoners in Darwin were considered to be political prisoners that were being held as a result of an ongoing war against Indigenous people, was the way it was discussed in the communist press, and the demand was for freedom for those prisoners. There was also sometimes some interesting and sometimes contradictory demands. Like sometimes they would demand, all Aboriginal juries, Like, they should be tried by a jury of their peers. And this was very much riffing off a campaign in the United States against the execution of what were called the Scottsboro Boys. These were black youth in the United States that were falsely accused of rape and sentenced to the electric chair, right? And there was a big campaign led by the Communist Party there to free the Scottsboro Boys. The Communist Party here took that up and actually used quite a lot of the same language and quite a lot of the same tactics to try to free. At one point, they said the Fitzmaurice River Boys. They were talking about the 8 who'd been sentenced to hang. So sort of using, some of the inspiration from what was going on in America to talk about the Australian circumstances. But you see them sort of struggling to relate the American circumstances to the Australian circumstances. So they demand all black juries at one point, or sometimes they just demand full freedom and they should be subject to their tribal law. There's some of the draft resolution, it's one of the model resolutions that they circulate in a newspaper called the Red Leader, actually encourages workers' organisations to call for Indigenous sovereignty. They say we want recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty. They have their own laws. They have their own code of laws that needs to actually be respected by the government. So there was a number of years of ferment that really takes off when Duckeye is sentenced to death. So at the start of August, the news comes through that Duckeye has been sentenced to death. And this was the cause célèbre, right? This was the person that they'd fought against the punitive expedition going in, and people really mobilised behind Duckeye. There's a mass meeting in the King's Hall that unites the Labour movement, the Communist Party central to organising the meeting, but they also have a number of these humanitarians speaking. There's an Aboriginal speaker from La Perouse also speaks at that meeting. So a mass meeting of, between 500 and 1,000 or whatever it might be, full King's Hall that takes a resolution calling for immediate freedom for Kaya and opposing the death sentence. And that's the start of then quite a hectic period of campaigning over the next 3 or 4 weeks. I argue that there's more people mobilised for Aboriginal rights in August 1934, probably than you see again until the 1960s. You had a number of mass meetings and a rally in the domain of 3,000 people demanding that freedom for Duckeye and that the charges are dropped and that he's set free. And so, you really did have this growing movement. You can see in the correspondence the government is sending to each other, like between the Northern Territory Administration and the Protector of Aborigines in Darwin, and also the Interior Ministry and also the Attorney General's Department. They're all writing to each other and they're trying to figure out what's going on and how they should respond to this movement. And the communists at this time, they had a barrister by the name of Fred Patterson, who was, quite a prominent barrister in Queensland. He ended up being a member of parliament, actually, in the Queensland Parliament, the only communist, I think, elected to the Queensland Parliament. Anyway, Fred Patterson starts talking about he's going to travel to Darwin to meet with Duckeye and represent him in an appeal to his decision. So it looks like the communists are going to appeal this case, and actually when they looked at it, the judgment was an absolute shocker. So there was every chance that an appeal could have been successful. Like, you can basically see the judge coaching the jury and telling them that they're not allowed to take on board a whole lot of stuff they'd heard in the course of the trial about McColl potentially sexually assaulting Duckeye's wife before he was killed by Duckeye and other features of the case. He is basically saying to the jury, you can't take this into consideration. You have to sentence Duckeye as guilty, right? So there's all these irregularities in the case. It's basically just like a kangaroo court. This Duckeye who hardly speaks English is given no rights at all, right? So they're actually very worried that if there is an appeal, it'll be successful. And so they decide to run the appeal themselves rather than let the communists get the glory of having this, this particular victory. So you've got a situation where the government is both prosecuting Duckeye and also appealing the decision on his behalf as the Aboriginal protector. Like, there's the chief protector of Aborigines or whatever can be involved, and they're going to actually appeal his decision. And because it's the government both running the appeal and defending the case, they just decide not to file any affidavits at all in defence. and Dakai is freed. Dakai is freed by the High Court. There's a decision in the High Court to free him. And if you go and actually read a lot of the literature that exists within Australian law textbooks, or, there's this mythology within the Australian legal fraternity that the acquittal of Dakai in 1934 was somehow some great moment of Australian justice. This shows that even an Aboriginal person who's a tribal person who couldn't speak English and all of that, even them who killed a police officer, they had their rights respected by the court. They had a successful appeal that went through the court. The reality is that appeal happened because the government was so scared of what would happen if they didn't run the appeal. And there was a growing campaign amongst the labour movement led by communists that they wanted to make sure didn't succeed. So, yeah, it was freedom for Dakaya, but it's not a good story to end because he got bumped off by the police. It's almost certain. So Dakaya disappears actually after he's set free on a rainy night, never to be seen from again. And, a number of historians say that the most likely thing is that he was actually murdered and thrown into the bottom of Darwin Harbour. So, as I said, you can really see the entry of the labour movement into the debate about Aboriginal affairs, the Communist Party taking a position in favour of Aboriginal rights. This does change Aboriginal politics. You've got a new force in there agitating that manages to shift the posture of the government, but the fundamental brutality towards Aboriginal people doesn't change. And there's new genocidal strategies that are employed, and that solidarity from the labour movement comes to be very important for a whole new cycles of struggle from the late 1930s.
So why have previous historians missed the significance of this sort of communist and working class mobilisation?
I think there's two reasons. Firstly, you don't know about it until you actually go and read the communist source material. So I didn't know about this at all until I actually went and read all of these archives that haven't been looked at before by anyone who's seriously concerned about Aboriginal rights. So maybe historians have read things previously, but they're not thinking about Aboriginal rights struggles or whatever, when they're studying the Communist Party or whatever. Or a lot of the archives I read probably haven't been read by anyone. So it's just an untold story where there's all these sources, through the labour movement that are really rich that people hadn't tapped into before. So, it was great to find some original material and be able to work with it. But the second thing is just what are people looking for? I think most people have got the idea that being in favour of Aboriginal rights at this time was for the enlightened middle and upper classes, right? This was about, being intelligent and being educated. And that's where you actually get the position of support for Aboriginal people. This sort of do-gooder, missionary sort of character is understood. What's not understood is the intelligence and tenacity of the working class, the fact that there's an incredible political sophistication actually through the working class movement, of people who were doing manual jobs, but at night were going to these mass meetings and crafting these incredibly sophisticated resolutions about global politics, and it's, understanding that it's actually ordinary people that drive political change, and understanding that there has been a really, really important fight from workers' organisations for Aboriginal rights at different points in Australian history. And for me, I wanted to understand where that came from. So I went looking for it. I went looking to understand how did the working class actually understand Aboriginal oppression, and how did people relate to that.
And so what's the significance of all this history for us today?
Well, I guess, just want to finish by just making the point that I've made these contributions about some of the important roles that communists played and some of the important ideas that communists had at the time. But my thesis is not a celebration of the Communist Party. As I said, racism was still rife in the union movement. Racism still ran through the party. It's not like just because people had a good theoretical position about Aboriginal rights, suddenly they were out there challenging all the injustices that took place against Aboriginal people. It was slow going in terms of finding places where there was joint struggle. But what I do think is very, very important is that there have been moments of unity. There have been moments of solidarity, and those moments have been transformative. And it's important that we understand that those moments are possible. It is in the objective interest of working class people to fight for Aboriginal liberation. We both share an enemy in the capitalist class, and we both, have a world that we need to build together, that actually respects the connection Aboriginal people have to the environment, to these lands that they've lived on for thousands of years. I think all of our lives would be so much richer if that connection was properly respected and resourced, and those rights were recognised. A free society where we can actually control our labour is also surely 1931, where we actually recognise thousands of years of connection and honour that in a profound way as part of the way we actually organise our society. So I think it's crucial to understand that working class power is very, very important for winning social change under capitalism. Any major steps forward for any oppressed group have always involved organised workers actually putting their shoulder to the wheel and bringing their collective power, to bear. And that's the case in 1931. It's also the case in 2024. And if we're going to build power that can actually end the horrific oppression that Aboriginal people still continue to face, the destruction of Indigenous lands, we actually need the workers' movement organised far stronger than it is and shoulder to shoulder with Aboriginal people sort of on those front lines. And we need to have a critical analysis of where failings of solidarity have happened, and also an understanding of where we've been able to make gains and where we've been able to go forward.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. You can find us online at www.peopleshistory.com.au, and you can download us on any of your favourite podcast apps. We're also on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at People's History of Australia. Catch you next time.